The first thing I remember about that morning was the sound of heavy machinery rumbling outside my cabin window. I jolted awake, disoriented and confused. It was barely 7 a.m. on a Tuesday in late April, and the peaceful lakeside community of Pine Haven, Oregon, where I'd owned property for the last 15 years, was usually silent this time of year. I threw on a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt, not bothering with socks as I shoved my feet into boots and rushed outside. What greeted me turned my blood cold. A massive yellow bulldozer was parked at the edge of my property, its engine idling menacingly. Behind it stood a small cluster of people, including Patricia Wilcox, the insufferable president of the Pine Haven Community Association, clipboard in hand and a self-satisfied smile on her face. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, marching across my front yard, the morning dew soaking through my boots. Patricia's thin lips curled into what I can only describe as a predatory smile. "Good morning, Mr. Hollister. I'm afraid we've reached the end of our patience." "Patience for what? And who authorized construction equipment on my property?" She tapped her manicured fingernail against the clipboard. "Zachary, we've sent you multiple notices regarding your unpaid fines and violations. The board voted unanimously last week to proceed with enforcement action." I stared at her in disbelief. "Enforcement action? You mean tearing down my cabin?" "The structure has been deemed non-compliant with community standards, and you've ignored all communications regarding this matter," she continued, her voice carrying that practiced tone of bureaucratic finality that made my teeth ache. "As per Section 8.3 of the bylaws, the association has the right to remedy violations at the homeowner's expense." I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was either laugh or punch something, and I wasn't about to give Patricia the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. "Patricia, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't received any notices or fines. We've sent certified letters to your primary residence in Portland, 6 of them over the past 8 months. That stopped me short. I'd moved from Portland almost a year ago after my divorce from Cynthia. The condo we'd shared had been sold, and in the mess of legal paperwork and emotional turmoil, I must have forgotten to update my address with the HOA. "I moved," I said flatly. "I don't live in Portland anymore." Patricia's expression didn't change. "That's not our problem, Mr. Hollister. It's your responsibility to keep your contact information current with the association. So you're going to demolish my cabin because I didn't update my mailing address." I could hear the incredulity in my voice. "That's insane. This has to be illegal." "The fines now total $14,750, she continued as if I hadn't spoken, "plus the cost of today's enforcement action." The bulldozer's engine revved behind her, and I noticed a man in a hard hat waiting by the controls, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Stop," I said, holding up my hands. "Just stop. This is my property. You can't just destroy it." "Actually, we can," Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The covenants you signed when you purchased this lot give us that authority." I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd experienced before. "Patricia, I don't know what game you're playing, but you're making a massive mistake. I suggest you take your bulldozer and your clipboard and leave my property immediately." She arched a perfectly plucked eyebrow. "Or what? Or I'll call the sheriff and have you removed for trespassing." She laughed, a brittle sound that echoed across the quiet lakefront. "The sheriff knows we're here. We filed all the proper paperwork. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a job to do." She turned and gave a curt nod to the bulldozer operator. The machine lurched forward, and I did the only thing I could think of. I planted myself directly in its path. Move that thing one more inch, and I swear I'll sue every single person here for everything they're worth," I shouted. The operator hesitated, glancing at Patricia for direction. "Mr. Hollister, this display is unbecoming," she said. "Please step aside." "No," I said firmly. "This ends now. I'm calling my lawyer." I pulled out my phone, and that seemed to give Patricia pause, but only momentarily. "Go ahead," she said. "It won't change anything. The board's decision is final." As I dialed my attorney's number, I noticed several neighbors had emerged from their cabins, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from shock to what looked disturbingly like amusement. Most were weekend residents like me, or at least, I had been a weekend resident until recently. After the divorce, I'd been spending more and more time at the cabin, finding peace in the solitude that Pinehaven offered. My lawyer, Daniel Friedman, answered on the third ring. I quickly explained the situation while keeping my eyes fixed on Patricia and the bulldozer. "They can't do this without proper notice," Daniel said immediately. "If you never received the notices, they claim they sent them to my old address in Portland. That's not adequate notice for this kind of action. Tell them I'm filing an emergency injunction right now. If they proceed, they'll be in contempt of court by this afternoon." I relayed this information to Patricia, whose expression darkened. "We've followed all legal protocols," she insisted, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Daniel says otherwise, and he's preparing an emergency injunction as we speak. So unless you want to explain to a judge why you deliberately destroyed my property after being warned about pending legal action, I suggest you pack up and leave." For a moment, I thought she might back down. But Patricia Wilcox hadn't become the most feared HOA president in 3 counties by being easily intimidated. "We'll pause for 1 hour," she conceded. "If your lawyer can produce this injunction in that time, we'll postpone today's action. Otherwise, we proceed as planned." I ended the call with Daniel, who promised to call the county courthouse immediately. As the standoff continued, I took stock of my situation. The cabin had been my sanctuary for years, a modest 2-bedroom structure with a wide porch overlooking Lake Pineview. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I'd poured my heart into it, especially after Cynthia left. Patricia stood with her arms crossed, occasionally checking her watch and making a show of her impatience. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, and I recognized several faces: George and Martha Ellis from 2 lots down, Ted Ramirez, whose property backed up to mine, and even old Frank Williams, who rarely left his cabin except to fish. "Zach, what's going on?" Ted called out, approaching cautiously. "Patricia's trying to bulldoze my cabin over some fines I supposedly owe," I explained, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Fines I never received notice about because they sent the letters to an address I moved from a year ago." Ted frowned, looking between me and Patricia. "That doesn't sound right." "It's association business, Ted," Patricia cut in sharply. "The board has followed all proper procedures." "The board?" Ted looked confused. "I'm on the board, and I don't remember voting on demolishing Zach's cabin." A murmur ran through the small crowd. Patricia's face flushed. "It was an emergency session," she said quickly. "Last Thursday evening, you were absent." Ted's frown deepened. "I didn't receive notice of any emergency session." "I sent emails to everyone," Patricia insisted. "I didn't get one either," called Martha Ellis, stepping forward. "And I'm the secretary. I'm supposed to take minutes at all meetings." The situation was rapidly unraveling for Patricia, and I could see panic beginning to replace her usual smug confidence. My phone rang, Daniel calling back. "Zach, I've spoken with Judge Harmon," he said when I answered. "She's reviewing the emergency injunction now, but she wants to know if you've actually seen any documentation authorizing this demolition. I looked at Patricia. Can I see the paperwork authorizing this? Her hesitation told me everything I needed to know. It's all in order, she said stiffly. Show me, I insisted. I don't have to show you anything, she snapped. I repeated this to Daniel, who let out a low whistle. Ask her directly if she has a demolition permit from the county. Patricia, do you have a demolition permit from the county? I asked. The flash of alarm in her eyes was answer enough. No, she admitted reluctantly. But we don't need one. This is a community enforcement action. That's not how this works, I said, feeling a surge of vindication. You can't just tear down structures without county approval, HOA or not. Daniel's voice came through my phone. The judge is issuing the injunction now. Tell them if they proceed, they'll be facing criminal charges for destruction of property in addition to civil penalties. I relayed this information, making sure everyone gathered could hear me clearly. The bulldozer operator killed the engine and climbed down from the cab. I'm not getting involved in anything illegal, he announced, removing his hard hat. You said all the permits were in order, madam. Patricia's face had gone from flushed to pale. This is ridiculous. The association has every right. The association has the right to issue fines and liens. Patricia, Martha Ellis interrupted. Not to demolish property without proper permits and board approval. I want to see the minutes from this emergency board meeting, Ted added. And the vote tally. Patricia clutched her clipboard tighter, knuckles white. This is insubordination. I'm the president of this association. And as president, you're bound by the bylaws like everyone else, I pointed out. Now, I suggest you take your bulldozer and leave my property before I file charges for attempted destruction of property and criminal trespass. For a moment, I thought Patricia might actually stomp her foot in frustration. Instead, she drew herself up and attempted to salvage what dignity she could. This matter isn't closed, Mr. Hollister. The board will reconvene to discuss your ongoing violations. Fine, I said. Send notice to my current address, and I'll be happy to attend and address any concerns. But until then, stay off my property. As Patricia retreated with as much grace as she could muster, which wasn't much, I noticed several neighbors giving me approving nods. The bulldozer operator apologized as he prepared to leave, explaining that he'd just been told it was a routine demolition with all the proper paperwork in place. No hard feelings, I told him. You were misled. Once the immediate threat had passed, my neighbors gathered around, asking questions and offering support. The consensus seemed to be that Patricia had overstepped her authority, not for the first time, apparently. She's been on a power trip ever since she became president last year, Martha confided. Harassing people about paint colors, fence heights, even what kind of flowers they can plant. Someone needs to rein her in, Ted agreed. This goes way beyond enforcing community standards. As the adrenaline of the morning's confrontation began to fade, I felt a mixture of relief and residual anger. My cabin was safe for now, but I knew Patricia wouldn't let this go easily. Her vendetta against me had obviously become personal, though I couldn't understand why. I'd never had any conflicts with her before today. Daniel called again to confirm that Judge Harmon had issued the injunction, prohibiting the HOA from taking any action against my property, pending a full hearing. He also advised me to document everything: the bulldozer, the confrontation, the admissions from board members that they hadn't approved the demolition. After my neighbors dispersed, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of the morning's events. Something about this situation didn't add up. Why target my cabin specifically? There were other properties in the community that could be considered in violation of one bylaw, or another Ted's boat, had been parked in his driveway all winter. And the Johnsons had installed a satellite dish last summer without approval. As I pondered this, I noticed Frank Williams making his way up my gravel driveway, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Frank was in his 80s and had been one of the original homeowners when Pine Haven was first developed in the 1970s. "Got a minute, Zach?" he called out. "Of course, Frank." "Come have a seat." He settled into the Adirondack chair beside me with a grateful sigh. "Quite a show this morning." "Not the way I planned to start my day," I admitted. Frank nodded, gazing out at the lake. "Patricia's not acting on her own, you know." This caught my attention. "What do you mean?" "Been watching things around here for a long time," he said slowly. "Seen associations come and go, board members rise and fall. Patricia's just the face. She likes the power, sure, but she's working for someone else on this one." "Who?" I asked, intrigued. Frank turned to look at me directly. "You know about the developer trying to buy up the lakefront properties, Clearwater Resorts?" I frowned. "I got a letter from them a few months ago, some kind of offer to purchase, but it was insultingly low. I tossed it." "Most of us did," Frank agreed. "But they're persistent. And word is, they've got connections with some members of the board." "You think Patricia is trying to drive me out to help this developer?" Frank shrugged. "Can't prove it, but it makes more sense than her suddenly deciding your cabin needs demolishing for no good reason." He had a point. I thanked Frank for the information, and after he left, I spent the rest of the day making calls to the county recorder's office to check the status of my property, to Daniel to discuss next steps, and finally, to a private investigator recommended by Daniel. If someone was conspiring to force me off my property, I wanted to know who and why. The next morning, I drove into town to the county offices. The clerk in the recorder's office, a friendly woman named Janet, helped me pull all the records related to my property and the HOA covenants. "There's something else you might want to see," Janet said as I was preparing to leave. "Someone filed a request for historical property boundaries for the entire Pine Haven development last month." "Who?" "A law firm in Portland. Benson, Harris, and Schmidt." The name meant nothing to me, but I jotted it down. "Can I get a copy of that request?" Janet hesitated. "It's public record, but it's unusual. Most people don't care about old boundary lines unless—" "Unless what?" "Unless they're looking for discrepancies or errors in the current property records." I frowned. "Why would someone be looking for errors in Pine Haven's property records?" Janet shrugged. "Could be innocent. Historical research, maybe." But in my experience, when someone starts digging through old boundary maps, they're usually building a case for something. I thanked Janet and left with a thick folder of documents. On my way back to the cabin, I stopped at the local library to use their copier, making duplicates of everything. I wasn't taking any chances. When I returned to Pine Haven, I noticed something odd. Patricia's silver Lexus was parked outside the community clubhouse, alongside a black SUV I didn't recognize. Acting on instinct, I parked a short distance away and approached quietly. The clubhouse was rarely used this time of year, especially on a weekday. Through the window, I could see Patricia seated at a table with a man in an expensive-looking suit. They appeared to be in deep discussion over some documents spread between them. I couldn't make out their conversation, but their body language suggested it was intense. I snapped a few photos with my phone, making sure to get clear images of both Patricia and her companion. As I was about to leave, the clubhouse door opened, and I ducked behind a nearby maintenance shed. "It has to be handled delicately," I heard the man say. "The last thing we need is a lawsuit drawing attention to the project before we secure all the necessary properties." "Hollister is proving difficult," Patricia replied. "He has more support in the community than I anticipated." Then find another approach. The timeline on this is tight. My client wants to break ground by next spring. I understand, Mr. Reynolds. I'll handle it. I held my breath as they walked to their respective vehicles. Once they'd driven away, I emerged from my hiding spot, heart pounding with a mixture of anger and vindication. This wasn't just HOA overreach, it was a calculated scheme. Back at my cabin, I emailed the photos to Daniel and the private investigator, along with an account of the conversation I'd overheard. Then I spread the county documents across my dining table, looking for anything that might explain why someone would be investigating historical property boundaries. It took hours of poring over plat maps and legal descriptions, but eventually I found something. When Pinehaven was originally developed in the 1970s, the lakefront had been designated as a single, continuous parcel extending the length of the community. This parcel had been subdivided into the individual lots that now made up the waterfront properties, including mine. But there was a curious note in the margin of one of the original surveys. Subject to riparian rights as established in Harmon County Ordinance 1926-44. I looked up riparian rights and found they referred to the rights of property owners adjacent to water bodies. Specifically, they governed access to and use of the water itself. I dug deeper into the county records Janet had provided and found Ordinance 1926-44. What I read made me sit back in my chair, stunned. According to the ordinance, when Lake Pineview was created by damming the Pine River in 1926, special provisions were made for the riparian rights of adjacent property owners. The most significant of these was that ownership of the lakebed itself extended to the property owners whose land bordered the lake, to the midpoint of the water body. In simple terms, I didn't just own my lot, I owned the lake bottom extending from my shoreline halfway across Lake Pineview. And so did every other lakefront property owner in Pinehaven. This revelation was illuminating. If Clearwater Resorts wanted to develop the lake perhaps for a marina, water recreation facilities, or even floating structures, they would need the cooperation of all lakefront property owners. No wonder they were trying to buy us out. I called Daniel immediately and explained my discovery. "This changes everything," he said. "If they're planning any kind of development that involves the lake itself, they can't proceed without either purchasing the riparian rights from each lakefront owner or getting easements. And you think that's why they're targeting me? To force me out so they can buy my property and the associated water rights? It's certainly possible. Your lot is one of the largest on the lake, isn't it?" "Yes," I confirmed. "It has about 200 feet of lake frontage. That's significant. If they've already secured agreements from other owners, you might be one of the holdouts preventing their project from moving forward." The next day, I decided to test my theory. I invited Ted and Martha over for coffee, along with Frank and a few other lakefront neighbors. Without revealing everything I'd discovered, I casually brought up Clearwater Resorts. "Did anyone else get an offer from them?" I asked. The responses were illuminating. Everyone had received offers, but only 2 had sold: the Petersons, who had moved to Arizona last year, and the Blakely family, whose cabin had been damaged in a fire and hadn't been rebuilt. "They offered way below market value," Ted said. "Not even worth considering." "The strange thing is," Martha added, "after I declined, they sent a representative to meet with me personally. He implied that property values in Pinehaven were likely to decline soon due to community issues, and suggested I should reconsider while their offer was still available." "What kind of community issues?" I asked. Martha shrugged. He was vague. Something about infrastructure problems and increasing HOA dues. Frank leaned forward. "Sounds like they're trying to scare people into selling. The pieces were falling into place. Patricia's crusade against my cabin wasn't just HOA tyranny. It was part of a coordinated effort to pressure holdout property owners into selling to Clearwater resorts. After my neighbors left, I received a call from the private investigator, Leon Torres. "Mr. Hollister, I've got some interesting information for you," he said. "The man in your photos is Andrew Reynolds, Chief Legal Counsel for Clearwater Resorts. And here's where it gets interesting. Patricia Wilcox received a wire transfer of $25,000 from a shell company called Lakeview Holdings 3 months ago. Can you trace Lakeview Holdings?" "Already did. It's a subsidiary of Clearwater's parent company, Norwich Development Group." I felt a cold anger settle in my chest. So they're bribing her. Looks that way. And there's more. Norwich has filed preliminary plans with the State Environmental Office for a project called Pineview Resort and Marina. The filing is confidential during the initial review period, but my contact says it involves significant development on Lake Pineview. This confirmed my suspicions, but it also raised the stakes. If Norwich was already filing with state agencies, they must be confident they could acquire the necessary properties and rights. What's my next move, Leon? Document everything. And I mean everything. We need to establish a clear pattern of harassment and conflict of interest. And you might want to alert your neighbors, the ones you trust anyway. Strength in numbers. Over the next week, I did exactly that. I shared my findings with Ted, Martha, and several other lakefront owners who seemed trustworthy. Together, we began piecing together a timeline of HOA actions that suddenly made sense in light of the attempted buyout, the increased fees for dock maintenance, the new restrictions on lake access hours, the aggressive enforcement of obscure bylaws against certain property owners, all of us who had rejected Clearwater's offers. We also discovered that 3 of the 7 HOA board members had sold their properties to Clearwater in the past 6 months, yet mysteriously remained on the board despite no longer being property owners in Pinehaven. This was a clear violation of the association's own bylaws. Armed with this information, we consulted with Daniel about our options. He advised us to call for an emergency meeting of all homeowners, as provided for in the HOA charter when signed by at least 30% of property owners. Once you have the meeting, move to suspend the current board pending an investigation into bylaw violations and conflicts of interest, Daniel suggested. You'll need a simple majority vote of attending homeowners to make it happen. We spent the next few days gathering signatures. Many residents were initially hesitant, afraid of antagonizing Patricia and the board. But as we shared what we discovered about the connection to Clearwater Resorts, support grew. In the end, we collected signatures from 42 of Pinehaven's 68 property owners, well above the required 30%. The evening before we planned to submit our petition, I received an unexpected visitor. Patricia Wilcox herself arrived at my cabin just as dusk was falling, her Lexus crunching on the gravel driveway. I met her on the porch, not inviting her inside. "What can I do for you, Patricia?" I asked coolly. She looked different, uncertain, even nervous. "May I speak with you privately? I don't think that's a good idea given recent events." She glanced around as if worried someone might be watching. "Please, Zachary, this is important." Against my better judgment, I nodded toward the porch chairs. "We can talk out here." Patricia sat, her usual imperious demeanor notably absent. "I've made a terrible mistake," she said quietly. "Which one?" I couldn't keep the sarcasm from my voice. "All of it," she admitted, surprising me. "The fines, the demolition attempt, it was wrong." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Why the sudden change of heart? She looked out at the lake, now silvery in the fading light. "I received a visit from 2 FBI agents today. They're investigating Norwich development for fraud and racketeering across 3 states. This was unexpected." "And what does that have to do with you?" Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "They showed me evidence that Andrew Reynolds has been bribing local officials and community leaders to facilitate their developments. They have emails, bank records, including my payments. So you're cooperating with them now?" "Yes," she whispered. "I had no idea how deep this went. Reynolds told me it was just about modernizing Pinehaven, bringing in new investment. I believed him. I wasn't sure whether to believe her apparent remorse, but the FBI involvement was a significant development. What happens next?" "They want me to continue working with Reynolds to gather more evidence, but I can't keep targeting you and the others. It's wrong, and now it could implicate me in their crimes. I considered this. The homeowners are calling for an emergency meeting. We have enough signatures to suspend the board." Patricia nodded. "You should proceed with that. In fact, at the meeting, I'll resign and recommend a full audit of the HOA's actions over the past year." "Why are you telling me this?" She finally met my eyes directly. "Because you stood up to me. You didn't back down when most people would have. And—" She hesitated. "Because I need to start making things right." After Patricia left, I immediately called Daniel and Leon to update them on this unexpected turn of events. Both advised caution Patricia's apparent change of heart could be genuine, or it could be another tactic. "The FBI involvement checks out," Leon confirmed after making some calls. "They've been building a case against Norwich for months, but that doesn't mean you should trust Patricia." "I don't," I assured him, "but this gives us an advantage going into the homeowners' meeting." The meeting was scheduled for Saturday at the community clubhouse. Word had spread quickly, and nearly every homeowner in Pinehaven attended. The atmosphere was tense as Patricia called the meeting to order, the other board members flanking her at the front table. I'd agreed to let her open the meeting, curious to see if she would follow through on her promise to resign. To my surprise, she did exactly that. "Before we address the petition that's been submitted," Patricia began, her voice steady but subdued, "I wish to tender my resignation as president of the Pinehaven Community Association, effective immediately." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. "Furthermore," she continued, "I recommend that the entire board step down to allow for new elections and a full audit of association actions and finances over the past year." The other board members looked stunned, clearly not having been briefed on this announcement. One of them, Richard Tanner, leaned over to whisper urgently in Patricia's ear, but she shook her head firmly. "This is non-negotiable, Richard," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I suggest you consider your own position carefully." Richard's face flushed deep red. He abruptly stood and stalked out of the clubhouse, followed by 2 other board members. Only Martha Ellis and Ted Ramirez remained at the front table, both looking relieved rather than upset. With the meeting now in disarray, I stood and addressed the assembled homeowners. "I think we all deserve an explanation for what's happening here." For the next half hour, I laid out everything we'd discovered: the connection between Patricia and Clearwater Resorts, the targeting of homeowners who refused to sell, the violations of HOA bylaws, and the plan to develop the lake itself. "Many of you don't realize that, as lakefront property owners, we hold riparian rights to the lakebed extending from our shorelines," I explained. "Clearwater can't build their marina or water facilities without either buying our properties or securing easements from all of us." The revelation caused a stir, especially among the non-lakefront owners who hadn't been aware of this aspect of property law. Patricia then stood, and to her credit, confirmed everything I'd said. She also revealed the FBI investigation into Norwich development and her own role in the scheme. "I was approached by Andrew Reynolds last year," she admitted. "He offered me what he called a consulting fee to help streamline the acquisition of properties for their development. I convinced myself it was for the good of the community new investment, increased property values. But the methods they asked me to employ became increasingly aggressive and unethical. The meeting stretched on for hours as homeowners asked questions, expressed outrage, and debated next steps. In the end, we voted to accept the resignation of the entire board and elected an interim leadership committee consisting of myself, Ted, Martha, and 2 other respected community members. Our first action was to engage an independent auditor to review all HOA records and finances. Our second was to pass a resolution prohibiting any board member from engaging in private negotiations with developers regarding Pine Haven properties, without full disclosure to all homeowners. In the weeks that followed, the FBI investigation into Norwich development became public knowledge. Andrew Reynolds and 2 other executives were arrested on charges of wire fraud, bribery, and racketeering. Patricia Wilcox, in exchange for her cooperation, received immunity from prosecution, but still faced civil lawsuits from several homeowners, including myself. The attempt to demolish my cabin turned out to be just one small part of a much larger scheme. Norwich had been using similar tactics in communities across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, identifying desirable properties, manipulating local officials or HOA boards, and pressuring homeowners to sell at below-market rates. As for my cabin, not only did it remain standing, but I used some of the settlement money from my lawsuit against Patricia and the HOA to add a new deck and boat dock. The lakefront property that Norwich had coveted so desperately became my permanent residence after I sold my house in town. The peace and community I found in Pine Haven, ironically strengthened by our collective stand against corruption, was exactly what I needed after years of personal turmoil. 1 year after the confrontation with Patricia and the bulldozer, we held a community picnic on the shore of Lake Pineview. The new HOA board, now operating with full transparency and strict ethical guidelines, had organized the event to celebrate the resilience of our community. As I watched my neighbors enjoying the summer day children splashing in the lake, the smell of barbecue in the air, Frank Williams teaching a group of kids how to bait a hook, I felt a deep satisfaction. Not just because we had stood up to corporate greed and corruption, but because in doing so, we had transformed Pine Haven from a collection of individual homeowners into a true community. Ted approached me with a cold beer in hand. "Hard to believe it's been a year," he said, handing me the bottle. "Sometimes it feels like it just happened," I admitted. "Other times it feels like ancient history." We stood in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. "Heard anything about Patricia lately?" Ted asked. I nodded. "Daniel told me she's moved to Arizona. Started over with a new job in real estate, ironically enough. And the FBI case." Reynolds took a plea deal. "He's testifying against the Norwich executives. From what I understand, the case has expanded to include projects in California and Nevada too." Ted shook his head in amazement. "All because they tried to bulldoze the wrong cabin," I laughed. "Sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most important discoveries." As darkness fell and lanterns were lit around the shore, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey of the past year. The attempt to destroy my cabin had nearly succeeded, but in failing, it had revealed a truth far more valuable than property: the power of community, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. The lakefront that Norwich had been so desperate to control remained in the hands of those who truly appreciated its value, not as a commodity to be exploited, but as a natural treasure to be preserved and enjoyed. And my cabin, once targeted for destruction, had become a symbol of resistance and resilience for everyone in Pine Haven. As I mingled with my neighbors into the evening, sharing stories and laughter, I couldn't help but think that sometimes losing what you have leads to discovering what truly matters. In my case, it wasn't just the cabin or the lakefront, it was finding my place in a community worth fighting for. The FBI investigation continued to expand throughout the summer and fall, uncovering a pattern of corruption that stretched back nearly a decade. Norwich Development had been using similar tactics across multiple states, bribing local officials and HOA board members, manipulating property records, and intimidating homeowners who refused to sell. Patricia Wilcox, despite her immunity deal, faced significant civil penalties and was required to pay restitution to the homeowners she had targeted. The 3 board members who had sold their properties to Clearwater while remaining on the board were charged with fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. As for Andrew Reynolds, his plea deal required him to provide detailed testimony about Norwich's operations. The information he provided led to indictments against the company's CEO, Marcus Norwich himself, and several other executives. The scandal became known in business circles as the Lakefront scheme, a cautionary tale of development gone wrong. For the residents of Pine Haven, the aftermath brought both challenges and opportunities. With Norwich's plans exposed, we faced decisions about our community's future. Some residents wanted to pursue their own, more sustainable development plan for the lake. Others preferred to maintain Pine Haven as it was a quiet retreat from the increasingly hectic world beyond our little community. The debate was spirited but respectful, a far cry from the secretive manipulation that had characterized Patricia's tenure as HOA president. We held town halls, conducted surveys, and consulted with environmental experts about the lake's ecosystem and carrying capacity. In the end, we reached a compromise that satisfied most residents. We would allow limited, environmentally sensitive improvements to our communal facilities, upgrading the boat launch, adding a swimming platform, creating a community garden near the clubhouse, while preserving the natural character of the lakefront, and maintaining the privacy and autonomy of individual property owners. The new HOA board, now operating with unprecedented transparency, created a community development fund using part of the settlement money from our lawsuits against Norwich and Patricia. The fund would support projects that benefited all residents while preserving Pine Haven's unique character. My own role in the community evolved as well. Initially seen as the catalyst who had exposed the scheme, I gradually became known more for my contributions to Pine Haven's recovery and renewal. I helped organize volunteer work parties to improve our trails and common areas, taught sailing to neighborhood kids on summer weekends, and eventually accepted nomination to the board when Ted stepped down to care for his ailing father. The cabin that had nearly been demolished became something of a local landmark. Neighbors would point it out to visitors, telling the story of the bulldozer showdown and its unexpected consequences. I sometimes found this attention uncomfortable, but I understood the symbolic importance the event held for our community. 2 years after the confrontation, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Patricia Wilcox, postmarked Phoenix, Arizona. I hesitated before opening it, unsure whether I wanted to revisit that chapter of my life. But curiosity won out. "Dear Zachary," she began. "I've written this letter a dozen times in my mind over the past 2 years, never finding the right words. Perhaps there are no right words for apologizing for what I nearly did to you and to Pinehaven." She went on to explain that she had completed the community service required by her settlement, working with a housing advocacy group that helped low-income families navigate predatory lending practices. The experience, she wrote, had transformed her understanding of home and community. "What I once saw as mere property assets to be managed, controlled, and sometimes sacrificed for progress, I now recognize as the foundation of people's lives and identities. Your cabin wasn't just a structure, it was your sanctuary. Pinehaven wasn't just a development, it was a community of people with shared history and values." I wasn't sure how to respond to Patricia's letter. Part of me still harbored anger for what she had done, the stress and fear she had caused. But another part recognized the genuine remorse in her words and the effort she had made to make amends. After letting the letter sit on my desk for a week, I finally wrote back a brief note acknowledging her apology and wishing her well in her new life. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that we all have the capacity to learn from our mistakes and to change. As the 3rd anniversary of the bulldozer incident approached, Pinehaven had settled into a new normal. The scars of Norwich's scheme had largely healed, though the experience had left us more vigilant and engaged as a community. The HOA, once seen by many as an adversary, had become a true representative of the residents' collective will, operating with checks and balances that prevented any future Patricia Wilcoxes from abusing their authority. My own life had found a satisfying rhythm. I divided my time between my consulting work, which I now conducted primarily from my cabin office overlooking the lake, and my increasing involvement in community projects. The divorce that had initially driven me to seek solace at the cabin was now a distant memory, replaced by new friendships and a sense of belonging I hadn't experienced since childhood. One crisp October morning, as mist rose from the lake and the first hints of autumn color touched the surrounding forest, I sat on my deck with a cup of coffee, reflecting on the strange journey that had led me here. The attempted demolition of my cabin, intended to drive me away from Pinehaven, had instead anchored me more firmly to this place and its people. The riparian rights that Norwich had coveted so desperately, the legal technicality that gave lakefront owners control over the lake bed, had turned out to be far more than a legal principle. They were a reminder of our connection to the natural world and our responsibility to preserve it for future generations. As I watched the morning light dance across the water, I felt a deep gratitude for the chain of events that had brought me to this moment. The cabin still stood. The lake still shimmered with reflected sky, and the community that had come together to protect both continued to thrive, stronger for having faced and overcome a threat to its very existence. In the end, Norwich Development and Patricia Wilcox had failed in their attempt to reshape Pinehaven according to their vision. But their failure had allowed us to discover and affirm what truly mattered: not just the legal ownership of property, but the shared stewardship of a place worth protecting, and the bonds formed when people stand together against those who would divide and conquer them. The bulldozer that had once threatened my cabin had become, in our community's collective memory, a symbol of resistance and resilience. And the lakefront that Norwich had seen only as an opportunity for profit had revealed its true value not in dollars, but in the quality of life it provided for those who cherished it. As the sun climbed higher and the last wisps of mist dissipated from the lake's surface, I finished my coffee and prepared for the day ahead. There was a board meeting that evening to discuss the proposed community dock, a project I had initially opposed, but had come to support after modifications to minimize environmental impact. Before heading inside, I paused for one last look at the water. A blue heron stood motionless at the edge of my dock, perfectly reflected in the still surface of the lake. In that moment of perfect symmetry between bird and reflection, water and sky, I saw what Norwich development had failed to understand, that the true value of Pinehaven lay not in its development potential, but in its capacity to connect us to something larger than ourselves, something worth defending with everything we had. The attempted demolition of my cabin had been intended as the beginning of the end for our community as we knew it. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a new beginning, one founded on transparency, collaboration, and a shared commitment to preserving what made Pinehaven special. As I watched, the heron spread its magnificent wings and lifted gracefully into the morning air, leaving ripples across the reflective surface of the lake. Those ripples, like the consequences of standing up to injustice, would continue to spread long after their initial cause had disappeared from view.